Welcome, one and all, and welcome to the show. I have with me Ted Hand. Ted, would you like to say hello to the audience?
Hi, good morning.
Ted and I met recently at the International Medieval Congress in Michigan, which I attend every year, and we had a great time hitting it off and talking about Pico, and we thought it might be a good idea to get together and have a chat about Pico and about magic in the Renaissance, and that will be the topic of our discussion today. Ted, would you like to tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm a teacher in the Bay Area in California, and I've been a grad student. I didn't get to finish my MA because of some personal tragedy and other issues, but for a few years I was working at Berkeley at the Graduate Theological Union, which is a nice little consortium of seminaries. And I was writing my master's thesis on angelology, magic, and Kabbalah in Pico Della Mirandola. Now, my mentor was a guy named Mark Delp, who worked on medieval Hermeticism and the use of Platonism and Thomas Aquinas. So I got to study thinkers like Plotinus and Proclus and Nicholas of Cusa, and I got a nice solid background in Neoplatonism. So I was really doing a lot of research on the Neoplatonists of late antiquity and how that informed Pico della Mirandola when he was writing those 900 conclusions. 150-something, if I recall correctly, drew on Proclus and various others from Iamblichus and Plotinus and the Kabbalah and all of that. So I was doing Jewish studies there. I got to work with the great Kabbalist, the Rabbi Lawrence Kushner, and a few great Jewish historians and theorists. So I learned a lot about Jewish mysticism, as well as the Neoplatonic stuff, and got somewhat of a background for understanding this very difficult philosopher.
All right. Well, that's a good introduction. That should be a good springboard to launch us into our first topic set for the day, and that is the diversity of types of magic in the Renaissance. When you're kind of jumping into this field, it's often easy to look at all of these disparate types of magic in a monolithic way, or perhaps in a way that is bifurcated along class lines. So we have ideas like high magic versus folk magic. You have very simplistic dichotomies or ways of thinking about magic, and those aren't necessarily very useful. So we thought it might be a good idea to quickly outline what it is, what all these different traditions are, in brief, of course, because books and books have been written on these subjects, which we'll discuss at the end of this talk. But until then, it might be a good idea to start with the Neoplatonists of late antiquity and see the bifurcations of their influence and how those come back together and recoalesce in the Renaissance. Ted, do you have anything to say on that subject?
Well, so my first thought is that, Pico himself distinguishes between natural magic, which he sees as a part of science, and demonic magic, which he thinks is the bad stuff, right, and wants to prove that he's not doing. But on the other hand, he's doing some unique things with magic himself, which can be tricky to pin down. I remember, and I noticed last night when I was reviewing your reading of the oration, he associates Iamblichus with the occult stuff in Neoplatonism, right? So that might be one of the sources of a Neoplatonic concept of magic for him.
Right. And he does say himself, he's quite aware that the term magic is equivocal. It can mean all sorts of things. And leading up to Pico's use of the word magic is kind of hard to find, hard to pin down in medieval sources because they just didn't use that term very much. They mostly used terms like Goetia, terms like nigromancia, which is the astral magic of the Picatrix, you get these different kinds of magic, and they are variously influenced by these works of Proclus, these works of Plotinus, as they were transferred through the Arabic world and commented on there and paraphrased and then passed along. And in the West, the Latins did their own translations of these works, and these kind of became foundational magical texts.
And then we have to deal with the term theurgy in the late Neoplatonists, which gets picked up by Pseudo-Dionysius, of whom Pico is a great fan. And we have to sort of sort out, is theurgy this religious magic? Is theurgy more of like a religious practice? What's going on with that? What does it mean with Dionysius that when we do sacramental theology, we're sort of becoming theurgic?
Right. Could you outline maybe a little bit of the debates concerning this issue of theurgy? It's kind of a hotly contested issue within academia because some people are applying the word in a functional sense, other people are applying it in a nominal sense, and some people are applying it in a substantive sense. So there's a real mess of how we ought to approach the problem of this word theurgy as it applies across this huge span of time.
Yeah, it's really difficult because we don't see, Pico using theurgy to describe what he's doing. And when he's talking about magic and Kabbalah and, getting angels involved and becoming like an angel and all that, one of my big questions initially when I started working on this stuff was, is Pico doing some kind of an angel magic? Is he anticipating what John Dee is doing when John Dee is doing a synthesis of this Neoplatonic tradition and the grimoire magic? Now, people like Claire Fanger use the term theurgy to refer to what the guys who were doing grimoire magic were doing, but I'm not sure if that's quite fair to apply to Pico or even to Ficino, who's, as you said in your podcast where you talked about the Yeats thesis was pretty good in differentiating between Pico's interest in the Kabbalistic magic and Ficino's interest in the astral magic. But then when we're looking at Dionysius, he really does use the term theurgy. There's various uses of a bunch of different words that use theurgy, and he's drawing on Iamblichus and Proclus. So in Dionysius, we actually do see an emic use of the term theurgy, but he's using it to mean more of like a sacramental theology and less the sort of magic that Pico is talking about. So when I first got into this, I thought, we'll just look at the term theurgy, right? We can look at how Moshe Adel is using theurgy to explain what Kabbalists are doing. Right, when Kabbalists are doing this theosophical, theurgical Kabbalah, for example, that we find in the Zohar and the Bahir, which were sources for Pico. Did Pico get attracted to Kabbalah as just another religious magic because of the theurgic element? But I don't think any of the Kabbalists that Pico was reading actually used the term theurgy in a way that I'm not sure if they would have necessarily even recognized the theoretical framework that Moshe Adel was using for applying theurgy to Kabbalah, right?
Yep. It is a very difficult term, and it gets applied all over the place. And even within itself, what is meant by theurgy? Is it God working? Is it, forcing the gods to act? Is it becoming like a god? There are these different readings of what even the Greek word theurgy can mean.
So one way in here would be to look at how, Ficino and Pico were reading the letters between Iamblichus and Porphyry, the letter to Aniba, which gets translated as On the Mysteries, where Iamblichus is at great pains to explain that theurgy is not that bad kind of magic, right? That we're not coercing the gods. That what we're doing is we're using these symbols that were placed in matter by the gods, which sort of give us an opportunity to link up with them and to rise above fate and become one with the intellections of the demiurge.
Right. So that should lead us into our next point. I think this sort of need to parse apart a dichotomy between Ficino's approach to magic and Pico's approach, even though they were both Florentine humanists living around the same time, they knew each other. They had fundamentally different approaches to magic, and Ficino's approach was astral, magical, but he was also a Catholic priest, so he would have performed Mass. He would have been familiar with all forms of quote-unquote Catholic magic. I don't want to call it that because that would be a Protestant projection, but this approach of Ficino's was markedly different from Pico's, even though they both relied very heavily on the works of Pseudo-Dionysius, who at the time they believed this was simply Dionysius the Areopagite, a disciple of St. Paul. But the idea was that the beatific vision had come to Dionysius, and he had most clearly related it in a way that everybody prior to him had not really. They had spoken in veils or they had spoken in mysteries, and Dionysius really lays things out almost explicitly. And his approach is to essentially purify oneself in this world, and in doing so, to rarefy the intellect such that it becomes absorbed essentially into the intellectual world, which is above and beyond the terrestrial and the celestial planetary world, above the eighth sphere, and outside into the angelic world, which is this purely mental world that is inside of man, essentially, because man is a composite of the three worlds. And the idea in Pico was to elevate his intellect and become like an angel. So we can see how different this is from the making of talismans in nigromancia, whereby you are calling down the ruhaniyat, you are calling down spirits from the planets, from the stars, into matter, and invoking certain spiritual entities to do things for you here in this world. And it's also different from Goetia, which is a summoning of sublunary demons or jinn, and trying to make them do your wishes here. So this is not a summoning of angels. This is a becoming of angels, and angels in the sense as of disembodied intellects.
And I think this is really where Kabbalah comes in for Pico, because he sees Kabbalah as doing something similar to what Dionysius is doing, right? He needs Kabbalah to be this higher sort of, if not magic, it's a sort of science of understanding the angelic world, or especially, he uses this term, the angelic mind. I think in his commento is a great place to look for, what he has to say about the angelic mind. And he uses a lot of the resources from the Neoplatonists to kind of sketch out the metaphysics of the angelic mind, which is sort of where the medieval theologians wanted to talk about the divine mind, right? Where these ideas are in the mind of God, and that helps to explain this intelligible world. For Pico, it's angelic mind.
Right. When we're talking about angels here, we aren't just talking about, young boys in, cherub-faced and fluttering around with wings and stuff. These are all, as is expounded in Dionysius, these are just labels or symbols for deeper realities. And I recently did a recording on the heavenly hierarchies, so if you want to go listen to that, you can go listen to that, and that can actually help probably better understand our conversation that we're going to have right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Listen to the celestial hierarchy of Dionysius. That's a great place to look for understanding what the background is, where Pico is coming from. I also recommend reading up on the concept of angels in Aquinas. There's a great book by Fran O'Rourke, what is it? Pseudo-Dionysius and the Metaphysics of Aquinas, which explains these links. And, Aquinas in his Summa Theologica, right, uses Dionysius all over the place to explain the concept of angels and to explain his own specific metaphysical advances, which I think that Pico is a little bit more hip to than Ficino. I think sometimes when he's arguing against Ficino's Neoplatonism, he wants to bring it back to this scholastic sort of a deal, like we read about this in Pico's metaphysical treatise, on being in unity.
Right. Pico is a lot less hostile to the church, not the church fathers necessarily. Ficino is not necessarily hostile to the church fathers, although he does kind of omit most of them, except for some of the earliest ones in his discussions, like on the Christian religion. But Pico had much more of an interest in talking about people like Duns Scotus, people like Thomas Aquinas, people like Roger Bacon, Albertus Magnus. And these guys all were definitely interested in Pseudo-Dionysius to various degrees of emphasis. So, for example, you get, starting with Robert Grosseteste, this emphasis on illumination and the importance that knowledge can only be acquired through illumination that comes from God. Whereas Thomas Aquinas takes the approach, the Aristotelian approach, which says that we need to come to knowledge through our senses. And then through our sense experiences, we come to more refined understanding of general principles. But you start from the sensory world and work your way up, not start your way from mathematical or formal principles and then work your way back through to the senses. And that approach was chiefly, you could see kind of a tension at work in the medieval mind between Dionysius's illuminationist theory and then the Aristotelian approach, which comes into the Latin university system from the Arab world.
Right, and I think, when we look at, the influence of Hermeticism, you did a great job of explaining in your Yates thesis podcast about how Hermeticism wasn't so much about magic, but to these guys it just seemed like another Platonist theology that supported what they were trying to do, reviving the ancient theology.
Right. It's, I think, probably a good time to talk about this idea. I've talked about it elsewhere, but for the sake of thoroughness, we should talk about what the Prisca Theologia is. Would you like to give a whack at it? Because I think I've given it a whack a few times.
So sure, yeah. So I dug up this great quote last night. I was reading the same book that you're reading, Amos Edelheit, on Ficino, Pico, and Savonarola. And, an important point that I want to make about the Prisca Theologia tradition in Ficino is that he saw them as ultimately stemming from Christian wisdom in the first place. So when he's looking at people like Hermes Trismegistus, like Proclus and Iamblichus, Ficino understands them as having come from Dionysius and others in that tradition. Let me find this quote. Here it is. This is in Ficino's On Christian Religion. The whole of the ancient theology of the Gentiles, in which Zoroaster, Hermes Trismegistus, Orpheus, Aglaophimus, and Pythagoras agreed, is included in the books of our Plato. Plato in his epistles predicts mysteries of this kind, which at last, after many ages, will be able to be manifested. Indeed, it happened in this way, for in the days of Philo and Numenius, for the first time, the intentions of the ancient theologians began to be understood in the Platonic writings, that is, immediately after the public appearances and writings of the apostles and apostolic disciples. For the Platonists used the divine light of the Christians to interpret the divine Plato. Hence, Basil the Great and Augustine confirm that the Platonists adopted for themselves the mysteries of John the Evangelist. I certainly found that the most important mysteries of Numenius, Philo, Plotinus, Iamblichus, and Proclus were adopted from John, Paul, Hierotheus, and Dionysius the Areopagite. For whatever magnificent things they said about the divine mind and the angels and other things which belong to theology was clearly adopted from the apostles. And we should explain that Hierotheus is the teacher of Dionysius, who is mentioned a few times in his texts. But I'm not sure if we know who this Hierotheus guy was. I remember he was one of the great mysteries when I was taking my course on Dionysius.
Right, and he may be a rhetorical device as well.
Exactly, or he may be a stand-in for Proclus.
Right, and that's kind of how we managed to date the actual Dionysius as not a contemporary of Paul, but since he has pieces of Proclus in him, that sticks him somewhere in the 5th or early 6th century.
Yeah, right. But in Ficino and Pico, they saw it the other way around, right? That their evidence was that, well, look, we see similar doctrines in Dionysius and the Neoplatonists. Our Christian guys must have come first.
Right. So what we have here in this Prisca Theologia narrative essentially is a time capsule of their picture of the history of philosophy as this kind of relay race of passing on this torch of revealed wisdom. And it's important to know that these traditions have changed. Like, we today have a different approach to understanding these narratives. We have different dates on different people. For example, Isaac Casaubon was responsible for demonstrating that Hermes Trismegistus was a 2nd century AD literary figure. I mean, the Corpus Hermeticum essentially is a 2nd century production. It is not contemporary with Moses. It is not the fount of the knowledge that Moses took from Egypt and brought to the Promised Land and set up for the Jewish people and then eventually influenced the Platonists. This is a story which has come to be encapsulated by this concept of Platonic Orientalism. Not normal Edward Said Orientalism, but is a different idea altogether that Platonism is disguised as ancient wisdom from the East. And this is very much a narrative of the relay race of this wisdom coming from the East and arriving into Christian hands. And in that way, it's also a very teleological narrative because it culminates in Christianity and culminates in Christian apocalypticism. The idea is that knowledge in its pure form is being restored, and that is going to be the tool by which Florentine Platonists and other people influenced by the same line of thinkers are going to defeat the Antichrist and bring about the end of times and the renewal of the world. So it's worth mentioning that as much as it is a history of philosophy, it is also a projection of the future of the history of philosophy.
Right, and this is another great place for thinking about what Pico wants to do with Kabbalah and magic, right? Because he sees, like Hermeticism, like Neoplatonism, Kabbalah is just another version of this ancient wisdom. Today we might talk about how Gnosticism and Hermeticism all sort of partake in this middle Platonic framework, right? And we can see how these guys were recognizing that. They just kind of had the chronology wrong, and they had this, this idea of the teleology. But so Pico was trying to understand Kabbalah as an ancient knowledge that's helping lead right towards the sort of Christianity he's trying to expound. And it's indeed one of the best keys to understanding the sort of Christianity that he understands, because if you can see it in Kabbalah pointing the way, right, kind of pointing the way up, it's been moving in this direction all along, and then that confirms his theory. I'm very interested, and we were talking before we started recording in the farmer theory of Pico the syncretist, and how Pico in his oration and in proposing this conference of debating 900 theses, he's trying to understand, he's trying to use this term Concordia. Right, he's trying to come up with some kind of a concordance of all these ancient wisdoms and seeing how they all sort of agree with each other once you put them in historical context, and once you do all of this work, all this comparative work, trying to see how they agree.
Right, and this was also a political project of Ficino and his students, as you can read in this Edelheit book, all of his students had this emphasis on this idea of Concordia because it was this ancient pagan goddess that people venerated as a way to keep together a harmony of the orders of society. But in this case, it would be a harmony of the orders of various philosophers, of various schools of thought, whether among Franciscans and Dominicans, or whether among humanists and schoolmen, or, among the various city-states. We can't divorce all of this stuff from the politics of the age, because each city-state was its own independent polis, and as much as they were threatened by forces like the Ottoman Empire, they also threatened each other and were threatened by France and Spain in various ways. So we have to see this emphasis of Concordia as a big part of Pico's project to summarize all of the learning of his age.
Yes, and it's helpful to understand that once we talk about the politics, that Pico himself was a count, right?
Yes.
He had a political position himself. He was part of the nobility, and, that's part of what afforded him the ability to become such a prodigy as a student, right? That he had so much leisure time to do all this reading and work.
Right. So perhaps let's talk about Pico's latter years, because Pico undergoes a kind of change of heart under the influence of his friend Savonarola. Could you give the word on Savonarola?
Oh gosh, I don't know if I'm quite equipped to explain who Savonarola is. I mean, he was this kind of radical preacher, right? I mean, it's almost as if Pico has gotten caught up in a cult, right?
But it's almost a cult that is contiguous with the lines of anti-Medician politics in Florence, and is trying to restore Florence to a republic rather than what he perceives to be a tyranny under the Medici family. So it's worth mentioning Savonarola was the abbot of the monastery of San Marco, and he started out with a humanist education, actually, and then eventually became sort of radicalized by his interest in apocalypticism and the kind of coming of the destruction of Florence because of Florence's emphasis on humanism, on homosexuality, on art, on poetry, on all of these different things that Savonarola thought were not very salubrious for Christians. And he essentially convinced Pico that Pico's project to reconcile all of these philosophers was not as important as taking up the black cowl of the Dominican order and practicing apostolic poverty and chastity and obedience, and really working on his soul, because Pico had been flirting with, well, he had been excommunicated during his lifetime, and this caused him to fear for his soul. And so there is a belief in the Middle Ages and afterwards that anybody who was buried in a Dominican habit would go straight to heaven. It's almost like a kind of talisman. And Pico definitely wanted to be inducted into the Dominican order late in life. He died before he could. He was poisoned. And one of the reasons why he was reluctant to take up these vows was, first off, he was a count, so he would be giving up all of that political power. And he was also, he was married, numerous times. He had a lot of living in the few years that he lived. I think he died at 32. He was a papal notary by the age of 10. So his life was kind of compressed. But in any case, he ends up being killed by poison on the same day that Charles comes into Florence and basically liberates it from Savonarola's takeover of the political scene there.
Right, wasn't he poisoned by his secretary?
Yes, although I'm not totally sure of the reason why.
Yeah, that's still sort of a historical detective story. That along with the adventure where he kidnaps the woman Margarita, I feel like we're still waiting for the HBO, prestige TV series on Pico. It's definitely some exciting and sexy historical fiction possibilities there.
Oh, definitely. And I mean, it's like a kind of side branch to that Borgia series as well that is not discussed because, Alexander the Sixth plays a role in Pico's life. He's the one who lifts Pico's excommunication that he received from. Um, I don't know if he was excommunicated for the theses or for the apology that he wrote for the theses, where he
Mm.
basically didn't recant. Um,
And there's a point that I have to bring up about Pico is that I mean that he was just such a brash, just sort of radical, just kind of I mean almost kind of a jerk, one reads this stuff and it's like how did he think he was going to get away with this? He was not trained as a theologian in the sense, I mean he had the philosophy, right? He was really smart, but he didn't have the tact. He didn't really know how to be diplomatic about
right,
it. Ironic, given that he is the Prince of Concord.
right,
And, like we'll see later in, somebody like Giordano Bruno, right? He's getting himself in all kinds of mess by stepping on the toes of the theologians. And you read his apology, and he's just excoriating, the very tribune that might be exonerating him.
right. And Pico offered to pay people to debate him.
Uh,
In the preface to the 900 theses, which he actually called conclusions. They're not even theses. These are like I've come to a fundamental conclusion that this is the case, and I will pay people to come and debate me. So that's the kind of like person that Pico was. But I suppose that the flip side of his pride is that he also had great need of humility, and he knew he did. And that's why he wanted to get close to Savonarola and really get involved with this project of becoming a Dominican, even though it was fraught with a lot of internal contradictions and cognitive dissonance for him. Something worth mentioning about Pico is that after his death, Savonarola and Gianfrancesco Pico, his nephew, had Pico's writings and definitely edited them.
right.
And we don't know where, we don't know how. We just know that what we get is filtered through an image of what Savonarola and Gianfrancesco wanted us to see about Pico. Now, that isn't to say that they didn't want to see this kind of like Augustinian road of redemption from wanting to be involved with pagan wisdom to the pure revelation of Scripture. So they may have left a lot of stuff untouched in that regard, but we can't be sure of what Pico wrote when it passed through Gianfrancesco, who was very hostile to Pico's project of synthesizing all these various philosophical systems together.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, we have to be careful. Like on the one hand, it seems like Pico tones it down towards the end. On the other hand, we do see a lot of his concerns, sort of below the surface, right? One place we can talk about this is in the Heptaplus, which I understand you've been studying lately, and he's still doing a sort of Kabbalistic project in the Heptaplus, but he's not saying it out loud quite as loudly as he was before. The Kabbalistic stuff is now a little bit subtler.
Right. The Heptaplus, for anybody who doesn't know, is Pico's book trying to reconcile Genesis with Timaeus. So the book of Genesis in Pico's mind is written by Moses, and Moses is encoding in the Genesis narrative all of Platonic and Aristotelian and Neoplatonic and Kabbalistic philosophy and mysticism, and weaving it into this encoded narrative called the Book of Genesis. And so it is a great read, but it is very demonstrative of all of his systematizing, all of the different traditions that he's drawing upon and trying to reconcile with the biblical tradition as a kind of special revelation.
So if you read Crofton Black's book on the heptaplis, for example, that's one of the places where you can read an argument that the Kabbalistic exegesis is still a big deal for Pico. And we read in Crofton Black about Pico's nephew wanting to emphasize this, this holiness and this return to Christianity and everything. But I think that Crofton Black does a great job of teasing out the Kabbalistic strands, which are still nevertheless present.
Right. It's worth mentioning here, since we're discussing Kabbalah in Pico, that Pico essentially begins the entire tradition of Christian Kabbalah, and Christian Kabbalah is its own thing. There are things obviously taken from Jewish Kabbalah, but there's very little you can learn about Jewish Kabbalah from learning Christian Kabbalah. And most of what finds its way into the West is Pico's Christian Kabbalah. Would you want to talk about some of the people that Pico influenced?
Sure, yeah. I mean, so I believe that Pico actually met with Johannes Reuchlin, who wrote two very big texts, the On the Wonder-Working Word and the De Arte Kabbalistica, who in turn influenced Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, the author of the three books on occult philosophy. And then there's John Dee, of course, who's now articulating a whole Christian Kabbalist system of conjuring, 100 or so years later. And even when we get to Giordano Bruno with the Kabbalah of Pegasus, right, we're still seeing some Christian interest in the Kabbalah. Then there's all of the alchemists who are using Kabbalah, and that becomes a new synthesis. You can read about this in the researches of Peter Forshaw, people like Heinrich Kuhnrott, or Robert Flood. So there's this whole Christian Kabbalist tradition. Even in Pico, we see that it's a major appropriation project, right? They want to use Kabbalah to explain the higher mysteries of Christianity to the Jews and get them to stop looking at the body and to start thinking about the spirit, or however you want to put that. It is interesting, though. I noticed I was looking into Giulio Bussi's research on Pico's Kabbalistic library, and Bussi makes the argument that whereas Pico does make his own use of these Kabbalistic sources, the sources themselves that Pico had were actually characterized by being authentic Jewish mystical sources. They weren't the sort of bastardized texts that we find later, where the Christianizing had already been accomplished. But Pico is actually, and when we look at his one of the Jewish converts who was helping to translate Kabbalah for Pico, who's known for wanting to play fast and loose with the evidence. It's almost ironic that Pico actually had legitimate, purely Jewish Kabbalistic sources to begin with. So whatever he's doing with it, however much the Christian Kabbalah is a sort of corruptive and appropriative move. At least they were working from legitimate Jewish sources. They were working from the Bahir and the Zohar and commentaries that wove in the Abulafian tradition.
And Pico's immediate teacher was Yohanan Alamano, who, as you say, was not necessarily the most traditionalist of the Kabbalists. And even in Kabbalah, there are various strains. There is ecstatic Kabbalah, letrous Kabbalah, and these different modes of doing Kabbalah, since it really just means tradition, things that have been passed down. There are various strands of this tradition. I should go on a little diversion here. to talk about some of my research on this subject, which is mainly what is this influence, or what is the stream of influence within Christianity that is seeking to bring the Jews into the fold. And so I've been tracing this back to people like Petrus Alfonsi, to people like Joachim of Theor, to these people with these grand programs of redeeming history. And the Augustinian model, which had reigned for about 1,000 years before these people showed up on the scene, was just that the Jews would convert at the end of time, so you didn't really need to worry about it because it would just happen. And it became increasingly, people in the Middle Ages became increasingly aware of the fact that that was just not going to happen. And as they saw the end of days approaching and approaching, they realized that they were going to have to come up with arguments and come up with tools of conversion that were not just to compel people to enter into the church by force, but to actually convince them. One of the things that is important to know about medieval Judaism, at least from a Christian perspective, is that Christians, their main contact with Jews in the Middle Ages was in Spain, and many Jews at the period were reading the Talmud, which in Christian eyes was a later development. It was not a part of the sacred scriptures. Therefore, they were all heretics. So it wasn't even that Jews were necessarily to be persecuted, but that these Jews that didn't appear to be like our expectations of what Jews ought to be, these are heretics and they can be persecuted as heretics. And so it's important to see Picos conversion projects within this larger history of people trying to eminentize the eschaton, essentially, by creating these tools which will convert Jews to Christianity.
Yep, and that's a sort of darker element to it when we might want to be talking about, this beautiful higher magic of Kabbalah, right? There is a kind of an ugly side to it.
Right. I mean, yeah, it's very difficult to deal with Pico, in particular in black and white, because he's such a strange guy that, he's a count who had to do countly business, which, usually involves riding around town and beating the shit out of people.
Mm-hmm.
And then at other times you have him, wanting to wander the streets of Florence and hang out with the poor in black robes to try to atone for all of this stuff. So, right. And what Pico would have thought was the greatest good is not the same as what we today would consider to be the greatest good. Should we talk about books that have kind of shaped the field of Pico studies? Maybe starting from the earliest ones and then moving forward. And maybe right now might be a good time to plug your upcoming book series as well.
Yeah, so I'm working on a few different projects. I'm working on an alchemy coloring book, which you can inquire about if you go to my website thriceblessedpress.com, just like thrice blessed Hermes. So in my alchemy coloring book, we're taking out a lot of the cross hatching and gray areas from these classic alchemical woodcuts of the 17th century and thereabouts, to make them easy to color in. And I've got a graphic designer buddy who's done some of that sort of work, and then I'm going to provide an illuminating commentary that helps you understand the symbolism and give you sort of suggestions for meditating on these texts. My other project that is we've actually just finished the typesetting this week is the Philip K. Dick Tarot deck. Now, Philip K. Dick is obviously a contemporary science fiction writer, but he was very interested in this Renaissance esotericism. He was big into people like Giordano Bruno, Jakob Burma, and Paracelsus, as well as the Rosicrucian scene. And he had this series of religious experiences late in life where he started looking back at his own writings, his own novels, and wondering, well, did I hide mystical allegories in there, without even knowing it? So he spent the last 12 years of his life writing 8,000 or 9,000 pages of notes that he calls his exegesis, where he's trying to figure out, how can I discover the Gnostic, Neoplatonic mystical secrets of my own writings, and did this huge research project looking into all areas of theology and Gnosticism and the occult and that sort of thing. So I thought that a great way to bring this to life and illustrate it would be to make a tarot deck based on his ideas. So one of his scariest books is The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, where the characters find themselves in a sort of false virtual reality after taking a drug, and they can't get out of this virtual reality that's ruled over by this demonic figure of Palmer Eldritch. So, I made that the devil card. And there's all kinds of concepts, sort of theological Gnostic ideas put into science fiction terms, and Dick. So he had a novel Valis, which is about this satellite that beams a pink beam of information into your head, and so I've made a Valis card, and I've made a pink beam card, and another of his novels is Ubik, where there's this spray can that can sort of restore you to your original condition when you've had this corrupting influence of the world, where your modern pocket watch turns into an hourglass, or your car turns into a wagon drawn by a horse. Like, things are going into this sort of like retrograde state where they go into the old forms, and you can spray your Ubik can to restore you to sanity, in a way that he eventually begins to compare with Christian salvation. So he started to think, well, what is Ubik? What is Ubik really? Right, I came up with this science fictional concept, but it must be a real spiritual force. So we used our tarot cards to illustrate these different ideas of spiritual forces that Dick conceived of, and put all of this Gnostic revelation into science fictional terms.
So who did the art for it?
So the art was done by a fellow named Christopher Wilkie, who signed on to the project about 5 years ago. I met him over one of the Philip K. Dick fan networks. I've been active in the sort of fan scholarship scene. Dick is slowly breaking into academia. We put on a conference in 2012 at San Francisco State. My buddy David Gill does the Total Dickhead blog, which is still around, and I highly recommend as a great archive of Dick's studies and fan culture. And there's a PKD fan group on Facebook where we all meet and talk about this material. And I've had the privilege of working for one of Dick's ex-girlfriends, the late Grania Davis, who was an amazing person. She met Dick through corresponding about the I Ching. And the I Ching is also a part of the tarot deck, which you'll just have to see how that works. We have a website up on Wide Books. If you just Google PKD Tarot, you can find out about it. And we're taking pre-orders for a $40 donation. We're going to debut the deck at the Philip K. Dick Festival in Fort Morgan, Colorado, where the author is buried, this August. So in terms of Pico Studies, a few early studies that are worth looking into. Avery Dulles wrote a study. He was was it a Catholic cardinal eventually? His undergraduate thesis was on Pico, and is one of the early studies that places Pico in the scholastic tradition. Perhaps too much in that direction. There's another fella, Craven, is it William Craven, who wrote a book about Pico, the symbol of his age, which does a great job of situating Pico as somebody who readers of every era want to make their own. So, Gnostic readers want to make Pico a Gnostic, and, reformatists want to make Pico a reformer, and, all that sort of a thing. Scholastics want to make Pico a scholastic. And There's a great article by Brian Copenhaver called Dekanting Pico's Oration, which tries to sort it out from the Kantian interpretations that we see. And, how do we make Pico the symbol of the Renaissance? How can we project onto him all of these scholarly values that we believe the Renaissance is supposed to exemplify? So that's a wonderful book for sort of deconstructing all of these all of these layers that have been added to Pico. More recently, M.V. Doherty has published a great collection of essays on Pico, where you can read Michael Allen on the Platonism and Pico's commento. You can read Sheila Rabin on astrology and magic in Pico. There's all sorts of angles. You can read about the condemnation of the different theses and unpack all of that. We talked a little bit about Crofton Black's study on the heptaplus, and Amos Edelheit's study on the theological background. Now, I thought that Edelheit does a great job in explaining about how Ficino and Pico are sort of competing responses to the same theological crisis. Now, looking at Pico, you might think, what's this guy's damage, right? Is this sort of a personal, vendetta that Pico has against the problems in theology of his day? But when you compare Ficino's On the Christian Religion to Pico's Apologia, we see that they're both responding to the same concerns. Pico's kind of a young hothead about it, right? But he's actually a really brilliant guy who's responding pretty sensitively to these theological problems of his day. So it's really the crisis of what we might call humanist theology and the Renaissance that both Pico and Ficino are responding to. And really, Pico's not that much of a maverick. He just seems more of a maverick because he got himself in so much trouble. If he had perhaps a little bit more tact, not gotten himself excommunicated, right? The whole tradition of Christian Kabbalah and Renaissance magic might have evolved differently. One wonders.
Right. Notable mentions to Chaim Wierzbowski's Pico Della Mirandola's encounter with Jewish mysticism, and also Moshe Edel's Kabbalah in Italy, 1280 to 1510. Those are pretty important for exploring the Kabbalistic angle of Pico's training.
Yeah, and one thing that I love about Wierzbowski is that he does a great job of engaging with the Dionysian material and the way that Pico was putting together Dionysius and Kabbalah. Now, unfortunately, Wierzbowski died before he could finish his study, and he didn't have access to all the material we now have on Pico's Kabbalistic library, so you really have to go look at the work of Giulio Busi. Fortunately, the Kabbalistic library stuff that he's printing is available in English, but Busi also has a couple of books in Italian that look pretty exciting, both about Kabbalah and about Pico specifically.
There's always, as well, Francis Yates, who, of course, we have lots of issues with, but that's probably the book that got everybody interested in the subject in the first place, since the first few chapters of her work is outlining what she calls the Hermetic tradition, and she plots the evolution of that through Ficino and Pico. But the problem is that Ficino is might be a translator of the Corpus Hermeticum, but it's not really accurate to call him a Hermeticist. And Pico certainly was not a Hermeticist. He actually went out of his way to avoid associating himself with that strain of wisdom because he thought of it as somehow antithetical to the idea that Mosaic prophecy was the utmost authority in his spiritual life.
And in the last few years, there was another master's thesis written on Pico, which I'm proud to say apparently benefited from the use of my notes. Greg Kaminsky wrote Celestial Intelligences, the Syncretic Angelology of Renaissance Philosopher Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. And this is a thesis that benefits from a lot of the research that we've been name dropping in our conversation today, gets into a lot of the stuff on angelology. and the researches of people like Stephen Farmer and Moshe Idel and all these folks. So I recommend reading that, especially if you're interested in the angelology stuff. I feel like we're still waiting for a study that can make sense of Kabbalah and magic for Pico. Brian Copenhaver's research is, of course, another of the best places that you can go to understand what Pico is doing with Kabbalah. But there's some disagreements between him and Farmer that are interesting and productive. You can get all of Copenhaver's stuff on his website, as well as his translations of the Kabbalistic conclusions. And then there's a great translation that Copenhaver did of a Proclus text on sacrifice, which is a great place to look at Neoplatonic theurgy and magic in one of the source primary texts there.
Right. Another important person we can't go without mentioning. It's almost as if, we take him for granted. It's Dr. Hanegraaff, who has dealt a lot with the reception of Pico, and especially as it pertains to the broader field of Western esotericism. You might call Pico one of the founding fathers of Western esotericism, because he really brought together all of these traditions that would eventually be rejected by the scientific revolution. Pico had an approach to reality which was not acausal, because he was interested in Aristotelian philosophy, but he thought at the deeper levels of reality, you have to leave causality behind and enter into a kind of hermeneutic or semiotic mode, and that's the only way that you can approach the divine. And that explains a lot of his skepticism about things like talismanic astromagic, astrology. He just thinks that at some point you have to go above and beyond the material world and above the celestial world, which are causal worlds, and into an acausal realm. What else about Pico? I think probably, we're talking about all these great books about Pico Della Mirandola, but the thing is, nothing is better than actually just going and reading his own books, because he's pretty clear, he's pretty lucid. He almost needs no glosses. If you have like a foot in the history of philosophy, you should be able to understand Pico's works on their own. He was very lucid in his explanations, and all of his books kind of work together. So we could probably talk about some of his works just so you can get an idea. The conclusions, of course, probably the best place to find the 900 Theses is in Stephen Farmer's Syncretism in the West book, which contains a facsimile of those disputations, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, you get the facing page Latin and English, which is very useful. So, you can get a second opinion on the English translation by looking at Copenhaver's website, where he's at least posted some of the Kabbalistic conclusions. But Farmer's the only place where you can get all of the 900 conclusions in English and Latin facing page plus commentary.
Right. Now, other works are the Heptopolis, which is his commentary on Genesis, trying to reconcile that with Neoplatonic metaphysics. He also has his Apology, which is a defense of his 900 Theses against the accusations of heresy. Later in his life, we have his De Ente et Uno, which is an attempt to reconcile Platonism and Aristotelianism, which had been thought at odds during the period.
And that's where Pico comes to a very modern take on the Parmenides, right? Where he disagrees with Ficino that the Parmenides and with the whole sweep of Neoplatonic interpretation, and he says, look, the Parmenides is just a gymnastic exercise, right? He's not actually laying out this theology of the one the way that the Neoplatonists would have you believe. Plato's not doing that in the Book of the Parmenides, but in fact, it's just this set of logical sort of hoops to jump through in order to become a better philosopher by sharpening your sword. And, Pico anticipates what is now, the kind of like modern contemporary history of philosophy take on that book. So that's a place where we can see how Pico is actually, kind of anticipating modern philosophy, and he's really, a brilliant and subtle interpreter, and he's also willing to kind of, set aside these sacred cows.
Right, and of course there's his 1496 oration, which we really can't overlook. It's been kind of touted as the manifesto of the Renaissance. I don't know how much we can confirm that statement, but it certainly
I'm very skeptical.
To me, it's not so much like a manifesto of the Renaissance as much as it is a culmination of the Middle Ages.
Right.
It's more of an expose on the sum of all knowledge and trying to systematize it in this mystical worldview wherein at its heart you become a disembodied intellect and you don't become one with God, but you ascend into the heavenly choir of angels, which is where mankind was before the fall, because man was created to fill the hole where Satan and his angels had fallen out. And then after the fall of man, we dropped out of that super celestial world and fell into matter, and we can climb our way back up. And that's very much the subject of the oration. And it was eventually later tagged on with the title, The Oration on the Dignity of Man, Oratio de Hominis Dignitate. But that was not Pico's original intention.
Yeah, really the purpose of the oration was to introduce his 900 conclusions as part of this this conference that never happened.
Right. And if you want to listen to the oration, I've recorded a version that you can listen to on YouTube, and there are also other people who have done their own readings as well, if mine is not to your fancy. But it's definitely worth your time to get a sense of where Pico's mind is at near the end of his life.
And it's also just one of the most beautiful, Renaissance texts ever composed, and and just a wonderful summation of mysticism after scholasticism and the recovery of ancient sources that we find in scholasticism. So the other two important texts by Pico, which I believe one of which we've mentioned, is the Commento, which is on a poem by Pico's friend Benevieni. And that's one of the places where Pico really lays out his theory of the Neoplatonic angelic mind, and where he gets in some more digs at Ficino, where we see, his competing take on Platonism and especially the Platonic theory of love, which you can read about Ficino's version in people like Chris Steller and Michael Allen. And there's, as I said, a wonderful article by Michael Allen explaining Pico's take on that and the essays on Pico collected by M.V. Doherty. Finally, we have Pico's Disputations Against Astrology, which is where we
co-authored by Savonarola.
Right, and we see there the square Pico, right? We see Pico trying to get back to his Christian non-mystical roots and arguing against astrology and trying to come up with a place for free will that makes sense in a more mystical Christian context and a less deterministic magical cosmos sort of a context.
Right. I would say that this is more of an anti-science work than it is an anti-magic work or an anti-mysticism work. It's Pico wrestling with the science of his day, which he sees as unsatisfactory, and also that ultimately science is kind of a means to an end. If you follow it as an end in and of itself, it's a dead end. And I think that there's something to be said about that. I should mention, I said that the oration was 1496, which of course is after Pico's death. That's because it wasn't published until Gianfrancesco Pico published it in 1496.
Right.
Pico had been working at the end of his life in 1494 on a work called the Symphonia Platonis et Aristotelis, which is, again, this idea, like De Ante et Uno, to try to harmonize Plato and Aristotle, but in a systematic, really comprehensive, like there's no way that like anybody can have any debates after this. This will be the case closed compendium of this issue. But he died before that. And he also wrote a whole bunch of sonnets, which none of them survived because Savonarola, when he was, doing his bonfire of the vanities, was throwing all sorts of art and like Boccaccio's paintings and things like that, just thrown into the fire.
And now, wasn't there also an unfinished commentary on the book of Job?
I have not heard about this.
I was reading about it. Don't quote me on that, but I think that Pico is working on a commentary on the book of Job and maybe one other commentary type text.
What a loss.
Yeah. But I haven't come across this material myself, so I believe that's a thing. But
Yep. So there's definitely no shortage of things that you can do in Pico research because there's just so many avenues into Pico and so many little aspects of his personality that can be parsed out. I myself am looking at the apocalyptic dimensions of Pico's thought, more so in a chapter of my dissertation, but it is kind of all roads lead to Pico because Pico was this great synthesizer of all these different traditions. So he's a good person to look at. In the immediate wake of Pico, the people who were immediately influenced by Pico, we have people like John Colet. So John Colet was an English humanist, hung out with all the other humanists like Erasmus and Cornelius Agrippa, and Agrippa definitely gets a good deal of his idea about like the three worlds, for example, from Pico.
And there's some influence on Thomas More as well, right?
Oh, totally. Yeah, Thomas More. And then there's a very important vector that we have to mention, and this is Wouter Hanegraaff who's done the work on this, and that's Ludovico Lazzarelli,
right?
Who was a Hermeticist. He lectured on the Pimander, but he didn't use Ficino's version of it. He translated his own, and that's the version that Cornelius Agrippa used. And Hanegraaff argues that Ludovico Lazzarelli rediscovered gnosis in its late antique form. Pico had kind of this idea of the spiritual intelligence, which is a term that you find in Bonaventure and in Joachim of Fiore and in Dionysius, but it wasn't the term gnosis. And that idea gets kind of rediscovered in Lazzarelli, who then passes that on into Western esotericism. And I would highly recommend reading Ludovico Lazzarelli's Crater Hermetis as well, if you are in the neighborhood of Pico Studies.
Yeah, I find it so beautiful that Lazzarelli calls Dionysius our Hermetic Dionysius.
Ah, nice.
And really, places Dionysius, once again, back into that tradition. A few things worth mentioning in terms of Pico's Neoplatonic sources. There's a great recent translation of Iamblichus on the Mysteries, or the letter to Aniba, where he was jousting with Porphyry, which is very much worth checking out. Plotinus and Neads are of course available in many sorts of different translations, which you should read. And Proclus, we have the E.R. Dodd's translation of the Elements of Theology. We have all of Thomas Taylor's beautiful translations of stuff like the Platonic Theology, the commentary on the Parmenides. And you can go down a whole rabbit hole and Proclus studies these days. Stephen Gersh has edited a great collection on the influence of Proclus. There's another great anthology that came out recently, All from One. Lots of great essays in English, making the thought of Proclus very accessible. And that's really one of the places where, just as Dionysius drew on Proclus for the metaphysics of the celestial world in, what Pico calls the angelic mind. So in his 900 conclusions, I think Pico was going really deep into the Neoplatonists, trying to understand the mechanisms, the sort of metaphysical nuts and bolts which underlie these theories of the angelic mind.
Right.
And I want to see more people working on this material, and it's just really difficult. You have to know Latin and Greek and Hebrew and understand the Kabbalistic context and the Neoplatonic context for all of Pico's research. And, one of the reasons he was so difficult for contemporaries in his age to understand is that the theologians who were evaluating him, would only read Latin, and they didn't have the Greek or the Hebrew, and they didn't know what the heck Pico was talking about when he was citing all of these, ancient thinkers and making these arguments for, cultural contexts and concord and everything. He was way ahead of his time in that way, and while he may anticipate contemporary Neoplatonic scholarship, people in his day didn't get that, and so they didn't necessarily know where he was coming from. So a lot of the things that he was saying seemed scary and heretical.
Right. It might be worth mentioning here briefly what these nuts and bolts of Platonism and the angelic world are. So the idea here is that each rung of angels, as they kind of cascade outward from the one or from God, embody different virtues. And that we as humans can become like these angels. We can participate in their divine essences if we practice these specific virtues. The virtue that is attributed to humans in their kind of angelic form, at least if we take the Psaltery of 10 Strings from Joachim of Fior, is charity. And so it's like by embodying the virtue of charity, you become a divine being. And humans can participate in the divine essences of various angelic intelligences and become likened to them. And in doing so, it is as if in their lifetime, on a parallel dimension, they break through into this angelic world and sit at the table with the choirs in various orders. And we can see this to some extent in Dante. Dante does a really great job of demonstrating how people who exhibited different virtues during their lifetimes wind up at different planets that surround the celestial world. And, the influence of Dante is definitely not lost on anybody in Florence at this period. So what we're seeing here is a kind of magic that is Platonic in the sense that we're finding these forms of virtues that live in super celestial interworlds, and that we, by participating in these virtues, can become like those formal disembodied intellects. And that is essentially the ultimate telos for man. And what I like to point out is that this is very similar in a way to this idea in Picatrix of the perfect nature. And this is an explicitly Hermetic concept, that the philosopher perfects his knowledge and then he becomes a perfect sage. But in the Christian Neoplatonic angelomorphic type of magic, you are not trying to perfect yourself here on earth. You're trying to essentially break free of the flesh, break free of the world, and join the divine minds, which are above and beyond matter. And so there's an element of perfect nature that is dualist as well, but it's chiefly a kind of non-dualist approach to this issue, whereas the Dionysian Platonic approach is very much, let's not say that the body is an evil principle in this world, but it is like the beginning of the journey. There is a limit on what the body can achieve, and it is very much a ladder of ascent from sensory existence, from the existence of beasts and brutish animals, to a climbing of a ladder of the intellect up into more rarefied states of rationality until you reach this level where will and intellect, which are these two forces within the mind, these basically collapse into one thing, and then you pierce through into the other world. And that's worth, I think, mentioning to get a hold on what Pico is actually after when he's talking about being a magician or something like that. He's not invoking angels. He's not making talismans. He is trying to become a super celestial intellect by participating in their portfolio, essentially.
Right, and I would agree with that. I think that Greg Kaminsky's MA thesis, I'll give it another plug here. He's making the argument in that thesis that it's really about theosis, that it's about mystical union. Pico is not so much trying to draw down celestial power as he's trying to, ascend into a more angelic state of being. So,
right. But something that's worth mentioning here is that unlike in perhaps a Buddhist tradition or something, there isn't a collapse of the subject and the object, that God and creation are always separated by an I-thou relationship. Humans can become perfected, but God is not perfect. And there's this idea in St. Thomas Aquinas that, and it's an appeal to etymology, that in order to be perfect, perfecta, you have to be factum, you have to be made. And so you can't be perfected unless you were created. And God was not created and therefore cannot be perfect. He is above and beyond perfection. So God is both perfect and not perfect and not perfect. And this is a distinction in the kind of enlightenment that is offered in Christianity than the enlightenment that is offered in Buddhism. You always maintain this observer relationship, and really at the top of it is equanimity, right? In the oration, Pico says, like, what is the ultimate goal? It's peace. And that is this peace that you would see in the smile of a Buddha, right? But it is a different approach, one that doesn't collapse that subjective-objective divide. It kind of just rests in it.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
Well, I think probably we should wrap up. Do you want to mention your upcoming series on books?
Yeah, sure. So I've got a podcast project I've been brewing for some time now. And the basic concept is that I grab a book off of the shelf of my library of esoteric studies, and I talk about it for a while. I might call it Esoteric Book Review. And when I do an interview version of that, I might call it Esoteric Book Chat. But these are very tentative titles. And, the idea is to make it very spontaneous, not too over-prepared, and just sort of dish about, my interest in this subject, why I bought the book, if I met the author at a conference, if I sent him an email, or if I talked to her, in a seminar, that sort of thing. Little bit of gossip, a little bit of my personal take, and also to be putting my own aporias out there, talking about my own perplexities and difficulties in working with this material. Just go through my collection that way, and talk about all the articles that I'm downloading and printing out, and all the books that I have stacked up in boxes, and just generally recapitulate my grad school career. My focus is, of course, on the Renaissance magic stuff. I got started with Ioan Culiano's Eris and Magic in the Renaissance, so I've been doing a rereading of that book. It's going to be one of the first major episodes I'm going to do.
And when do you think we'll be expecting to see something like that?
Sometime this summer, let's say.
Yeah, okay, nice. So where can people find you on Twitter or online if they want to connect and not lose you in the void of the internet?
Great. So the best place to find me is at T3DY on Twitter, and on Instagram, some rapper is using that same handle, so I have to be T3DY hand on Instagram, and that's where I post a lot of those, great mystical diagrams and alchemical woodcuts and, various contemporary occult memes and stuff. If you like the visionary art and all that kind of thing, follow me on Instagram. You can reach me at ted.hand@gmail.com if you want to talk about any of this material or, follow up on any of these readings, or I can help you with, sort of any research you might have in Renaissance magic or esotericism generally. I'm always welcome that sort of question. And then I also have a blog, Alchemical Emblems, Occult Diagrams, and Memory Arts, which is on Blogspot. And there's a Facebook page for that blog too, and that's where I post a lot of stuff. Then, as I said, my alchemical coloring book is at thriceblessedpress.com, and my PKD Tarot is available for pre-order at Wide Books.
All right. Well, thank you for all that, and thank you for joining the show and being with me to talk about Pico. It's definitely one of my favorite people to talk about, so I'm always happy to have somebody who is knowledgeable on the subject, helping me out, because there's just so many things. It's impossible for me to sit down and flesh out all my thoughts in one sitting. So it's good to have a dialectic about it to jog the memory.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a delight. And similarly, I benefit a great deal from your friendship and the exchange. So yeah, thanks very much for the invite.
Well, thank you. And will you be going to the Kalamazoo conference again next year, perhaps?
Oh, gosh, I hope so. And, coming up in a week or so on the 22nd, I'll be seeing that little conference with Noam Chomsky and Marla Segel and Noah Gardner talking about the origins of language and Kabbalah and Islamic lettrism. So that's my next big conference.
That sounds pretty awesome.
Yeah, well, I'll be happy to report back and maybe
please
do a show about it.
All right. Well, with that said, I'm going to head out. And thanks for being with us, Ted. And hope everybody has a good day.
Yeah, to all the listeners, happy reading. I hope you follow up on this stuff and get back to us about what you find.
Yes, please do. All right. Peace.
Peace.